have Kirk and the challenges and opportunities of aquaculture, evidence from the Great South Bay.
Good afternoon. Thank you to the organizers for putting on what is again a fantastic conference. I'm always with an awe of the presentations that I get to hear and really humbled by what I can offer in sort of the small part of the world that I'm a part of. But today I want to give a talk on a part of a paper that I've been working on with John Antonacci, who's also here, on some work, especially as it regards oyster production in the Great South Bay. We presented on this work actually at World-Ecology conferences in the past. This is a different sort of aspect of that that I'll talk about today. As we know, capitalism is about power and power to appropriate and control. And a key source of that power comes from the control of space and humans by separating certain humans from nature, determining what is produced and what's consumed, what is productive and unproductive, what is a cost and a free gift. The ability to control labor through the discipline of time, closures, and wages is an important part. And it really is the antithesis of freedom, and I think most of us would agree with that, at least for most people. But yet, within the history of the development of oyster fisheries in the Great South Bay, there is a discourse of freedom that is part of it. Some of that is certainly a romanticized view of of life at water and life at sea that exists not just on the bay, but many other places. But for the people that are working on the bay themselves, oftentimes when talking to them, they discuss this idea that they get to go out, control their day, and they're away from land and the problems that exist within it sometimes. The problem, of course, is that this forgets the history of the appropriation of land and water. That appropriation of land and water took place by the removal of the indigenous who had control of all of the space, of course, originally. The exclusion of women who were removed from production and moved into the home where they were unpaid labor. This began, the privatization of the land and water began with the King of England, who essentially deemed all of the land in the area to be under the control of England in the mid-17th century. It's a freedom that exists only for those who have the time and leisure and capital to enjoy it. Those that need to work on the water to survive have a much different view of that freedom, in which there is very little freedom at all. Their days are determined by the marketplace. How long they have to stay out is determined by how much they have to produce to sell it in the market in order to survive. But yet, there is some truth to the idea that exists that their lives are relatively, at least for some people, less under the control of capitalism than others. And it is arguably better than it exists for many people. They do have some control over their daily lives. And water itself has remained outside of the control of capitalism to some extent, not necessarily in the Great South Bay, but throughout the world. There are places that exist that are relatively uncontrolled. Part of that occurs because it's not fixed, and especially as you move further away from land and you get more distant, then the less and less control is exerted. But the end of this real or imagined freedom for the baymen and others really happened over the course of history in the Great South Bay, where a big part of the closing of the fisheries occurred through degradation. And much of this occurred through runoff, actually, from agricultural production on Long Island, but also much of Long Island is still, some of you might not believe, not sewered. Many people still have cesspools in their backyard that leaches nitrogen directly into the Great South Bay. A problem that's existed for some time and is still not being fixed, at least in any sort of meaningful way. So there's a lot of nitrogen runoff. Many parts of the Great South Bay get closed for even public use during the summer times with algal blooms. But the areas that had been used for people, sort of the commons that had existed where people were going out and fishing for sustenance, have been closed by the Department of Environmental Conservation. And so what has existed in its place is really aquaculture. And aquaculture is, for capitalism, a very nice fix to many of the problems that exist within water-based environments. It provides a predictable source of product, right, for a marketplace, but it is very capital and energy intensive. There are studies, some admittedly by the World Bank here, that have argued that it is a sustainable solution. And one of the aspects that makes it sustainable is that there is a reduction in bycatch. When you are practicing aquaculture, there's only the species that you have within the pens that you're raising. It is a local instead of a distant production, so you're not sending boats out across the oceans in search of the food. And I think probably laughably for us, the World Bank says, in value, this is a great thing because developing countries are able to export to developed countries. There's a lot of problems with that, and the small-scale production that they're claiming here is really not through aquaculture. It's really through the fisheries themselves. It has been, I think, what most of us probably are more familiar with, the argument that it is very problematic. It is an energy and capital-intensive production. The use of fish meal itself to feed the fish that exists within the pens is problematic. Many of the fish species that exist don't seem to be environmentally friendly. There's a lot of waste production. There's space involved. There's potential of unintentional release of non-native species, which has existed. There's a great study about the clearing of mangroves for shrimp production. And really what I don't think gets discussed much, but might be something that would interest this group more, is it's really just another confined animal feeding operation, right? I think there's certainly an argument that people have made about oysters not being life in the same way that other forms of life are, but that is what's happening. You're confining the animals, raising them, and for oyster production, you're raising them from seed that's grown off-site in the pens themselves and then moving those into the marketplace afterward. So you're reducing life to a commodity. But the World Bank itself, and I think others, are recognizing that oysters do provide some potential. You don't have to feed oysters once they're in the water place. They don't produce waste products, and they do clean the water itself. So, well, keep going. The problem that's existed within the Great South Bay, at least for aquaculture production, is that it's really boutique production. There's been a dramatic expansion of oyster production out in the waters themselves away from the land, but most of that production is taking place by people that are trying to produce it for the marketplace. As a luxury good in the marketplace. One of the oyster producers that I've talked to, who has his own business card and refers himself as the master shucker, hires himself out for people that are having parties, and they bring in a bunch of oysters and he shucks them on the spot for people, in addition to working in oyster bars and other places. He told me he worked at a big event at Billy Joel's mansion. So there's a high-end marketplace for the oyster products themselves. This, of course, defeats the purpose of oysters as a utopian, at least oyster production and aquaculture of oysters as a utopian project. But I think there is some potential that does exist. So if we are thinking about the culture of care, something to have during the transition to or after capitalist ecology, the way that aquaculture is existing in the Great South Bay is not that solution, and I wouldn't recommend that. And I'm not aware of aquaculture that does exist that is a viable solution, at least as I think most of us would think about it. The town program, the existence of the space that's being used for boutique production right now is being leased from the town. The town's charging people to do it. They're limiting some of the worst abuses. They are leasing out only 5-acre spaces, and they're, at least as far as I can tell, preventing the consolidation of that space. They also don't allow dredging, so they're some attempt to protect the bay, but they have this imagined sort of return to a past, and that past is this world of the baymen, right? It's not a world in which you have the voices of the indigenous or women or others involved in that process, or even being actively participating in that process. It's a very costly very costly to get into the oyster production business. But if we did use this idea of being able to produce food, and again, I think we have to seriously consider whether we think oysters should be a food product. But if we do need to feed many, many people and do so in a way that is relatively sustainable, oysters might provide some bit of a solution to many of the issues that Patel and Moore argued were part of what I think is a utopian vision of the future. One other thing, just before I end, is one of the things that oysters do besides provide a really high quality food source and filtering the water is that they can provide and have provided natural storm barriers. So as the problems with the environment increase, and we've seen a number of increasing storms in the world, oyster beds themselves can provide what we think of as natural storm barriers. There's a large project taking place within New York Harbor, the Billion Oyster Project, providing grants for people in order to reseed and restock or create new oyster beds. And it is imagined, at least by some, as a solution to many of the problems that exist. New York, after Superstorm Sandy, had many ideas about what to do. One of them was to build a giant seawall off of New York Harbor. Instead of doing that, something like this could be a more sustainable solution than that. So again, I don't, and maybe I should have changed the title of the talk. I don't want to suggest that aquaculture as it exists right now is a solution. It is certainly not. It would need to be part of a system-wide solution, both of changes in the land and on the water, and the relations between humans and non-human or extra-human species, I should say. But I think there is potential there with some changes to the way aquaculture is being done to provide at least some hope for a better future.